I just feel like I have to comment on the last presentation. As a teacher educator, I think I'm actually speechless. The infrastructure and attention to teacher development is really astounding. So my name is Geoffrey Phelps. I think I'm just going to start and very briefly say a few things about my background so you know who I am. Some of it might be relevant to the discussion we're going to have. I started out in education as a classroom teacher. I taught for 12 years in a high poverty school in Vermont, mostly as a first grade teacher. My experiences as a teacher, and in particular things that I felt that I was really ill-prepared for, and things that surprised me. You know, obviously I struggled with teaching, all beginning teachers do, but I also struggled with the subject matter in ways that had really never occurred to me could be an issue, and that really brought me back to do doctoral work. My research, both as a graduate student and later as part of the faculty at the University of Michigan, focused on issues around understanding and studying teaching quality, efforts to improve teaching quality, reform efforts of various sorts, research on teacher preparation and outcomes around teaching quality. I had the great privilege over a decade at Michigan of working with a just outstanding group of senior faculty, colleagues, all interested in the same set of questions. Sometimes you luck out in life, and I did. I landed at the right place. I had worked with David Cohen as my initial advisor, Deborah Ball, Brian Rowan, Stephen Raudenbush, Marianne Palanzar, Hi Bass. I was a cohort colleague of Heather Hill and shared an office with her for many years. Joanne Carlisle and I did a number of studies together. And partly because of who I worked with and things that they were paying attention to, I became very aware that we have an anemic set of measures for understanding teaching quality and for studying it. That was certainly true now, gosh, how many decades do I have to go back? Maybe 3 decades ago. I think it's still true today that we have an inadequate set of measures. And I, because of what I was doing and what I wanted to learn about, got involved in developing measures of various sorts. It was a central part of my work at Michigan. And partly because of that work, I sort of fell backwards into an unusual kind of career move for somebody with my background and went to ETS, the Educational Testing Service. And there were really 2 reasons for that. One was that it became really clear to me that we needed new measures. It also was clear that if you care about stuff, you should figure out how to measure it, or else you have really poor ways of understanding, poor ways of pointing to its importance and certainly improving things like teaching quality. So I've been now at ETS for about 15 years, and it would be remiss of me to have not started this way and made a bit of a plug for measurement, for assessment. I've also been noticing as we've been going through the talks today how absolutely central measurement has been to some of the work that's been shared. We certainly wouldn't be able to say the things we can say and know the things we can know without really good, sophisticated, high-quality measures. I've also noticed that most of the measures that we've been talking about have been measures of students and student achievement. We have a far less developed set of measures of teaching and teaching quality, or things that are related to, teaching competence, like knowledge, beliefs, skills. Again, progress is being made, but, it's noteworthy when you see presentations around topics that we care about, like improvement and future directions in mathematics and mathematics education, that often you won't see good measures of teaching. So just a plug for attending to teaching. So a second plug on teaching. One theme that has cut through every presentation today is that improving opportunity in mathematics is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts, and they all matter. But another theme is that teaching has a special role. Almost everything that has been shared today, in particular as it translates into opportunities for students, simply is not possible without high-quality teaching, and that's not possible without high-quality teacher preparation, which is part of why the last presentation kind of took my breath away a little bit. So that's a real theme, which also makes me delighted because I had a role in thinking about how we might comment on this general problem. And I had the privilege and good luck of inviting the three panelists today who all have very interesting things to say about the set of presentations that we heard today. We're going to start with Morgan Polikoff, who is a professor at the University of Southern California. Morgan has really, for most of his career, worked on understanding various aspects of policy reforms around instructional improvement, attending to things like curriculum, standards, assessment, understanding how to measure and characterize those components, but also how their sort of alignment into some kind of systematic approach. I think we saw an interesting example in the last presentation around the teaching components, all end up supporting instructional improvement. Another little theme that's come up today is around COVID disruption, actually important right now if we're trying to think about improvement. And Morgan's been doing really interesting work on COVID-related disruptions as well. So, I'm going to be excited to hear what he has to say about that. Next, we're going to hear from Yvonne Lay. She's a professor at University of Nebraska, Lincoln. I really wanted to have a mathematician here. We're talking about mathematics improvement. Often these conversations either happen with only mathematicians and nobody else, or in rooms with no mathematicians at all. We need to bring together different perspectives on mathematics, what should be taught. Yvonne is a mathematician, that's her background, but she's a mathematician who's been very interested in teacher preparation. That's now one of her primary roles. And she's thought really hard about the kinds of mathematical competencies that really matter for effective instruction. Another kind of theme that's been through today is a lot of the things we care about around effective teaching only matter if teachers have developed the kind of knowledge and I shouldn't say they only matter. They end up getting enacted when teachers have the kind of mathematical knowledge and competencies that are really centrally important. So, I'm looking forward to hearing Yvonne's comments. And then finally, Maisha Moses is going to bring another entirely different perspective that is really centered around equity. Maisha she has a key role in the Young People's Project, which has its DNA in the Algebra Project, which was started by Bob Moses, with a focus on educational opportunity, and especially really high leverage subjects like algebra that are gateways to future education and sort of life opportunity as an absolutely key component of equity. And I'm looking forward to hearing Maisha's comments in particular, because one of the things we've heard a little bit less about today is how really direct attention to populations of students who might have historically been underserved by schools, or just bring with them particular kinds of life experiences, funds of knowledge, and other unique attributes that can be attended to and built up in supporting math reform. So 3 really different perspectives. I'm looking forward to hearing what they all have to say. So here's how this is going to go. Each one of them is going to take a little bit of time to talk about their work and through their lens, comment on the presentations this morning. We'll open it up for a little bit of discussion. Then we'll go on to the next person and do the exact same thing, have a presentation, open it up to discussion, and then do the final presentation. And then if time remains, have a little bit of additional discussion about topics, especially if you would really like to hear any of our panel members comment on anything particular that you've been thinking about. We can move to a more general discussion at the end. And I'll be moderating and kind of keeping things rolling. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Morgan.
Thank you. Really nice to be here and to hear from the speakers. I'm not a person who has done much international work, so I really appreciate the international lens. So I'm going to comment on basically 3 buckets of things. And the first, as was alluded to, is this idea of the systems and structures of American education. And you can contrast that with the last presentation we saw, which is very tightly organized, very detailed, very comprehensive system for supporting teaching. And, as was mentioned, I have spent my career largely studying standards and curriculum policies, so how those policies get enacted in classrooms. And this is, I would say, arguably the most enduring and important policy reform of the last 30 years, originating, coming from places like Texas to the federal scene, through No Child Left Behind. And the idea really is to start to implement start to strengthen the systems, right? The instructional guidance systems in American education. Because the reality is that there is no U.S. education system. There are 50 states with 50 different educational systems, and there are 13,000 school districts with their own policies and practices, and there are even more beyond that, charter schools and private schools and all kinds of systems and structures. And what we saw through the standards movement was really an effort to create some guidelines, some consistent expectations about what teachers were supposed to be teaching and what students are supposed to be knowing, learning, to support those guidelines with aligned policy instruments like high-quality assessments, like curriculum materials and professional learning. And the idea was that teachers would move their instruction in the direction of the standards, that instruction would get better quality, that students would learn more. And as I wrote in a book that I published in 2021 called Beyond Standards, by and large, this movement has not been successful. I will say in mathematics, there is some pretty decent evidence that in those early years of No Child Left Behind, that student performance did really improve. But if you were to go into American classrooms, even 2 classrooms in the same school, you would not likely see instructional coherence, right? It is not the case that, we heard a number of examples today of, in this location, they have 1 textbook. Well, you could have multiple schools in a district that have different textbooks. You could have multiple teachers in a given school using different textbooks. And you could also have textbooks sitting on the shelf in the back of the room and teachers using curriculum materials that they download from the internet the night before. And so the idea of this high-level standards document leading to the kind of instructional coherence that we see in these exemplar countries is very detached from the reality of the way that American education systems are structured. And so I do think that there is some movement in this direction, that there is more attention being paid in particular to the role of high-quality curriculum materials as an essential element of instructional improvement. So I think under No Child Left Behind, and for a while it was sort of like, we're not going to touch curriculum materials because that's getting a little bit too much government meddling in, what's going on in classrooms. But I think we're seeing now in states, starting, I would say, with the so-called science of reading movement, which has taken off in now I think over 20 states have enacted science of reading laws, that states are saying, no, we really do have an important role to play in ensuring that every student has access to a quality curriculum material, in supporting teachers to understand and implement those materials. And so we do have statewide reforms in places like Louisiana and Mississippi, where teachers are getting aligned professional development that is provided by the State Department of Education, and that does really seem to be moving the needle on instruction and student performance. So there is some, I think, potentially promising movement in that direction. But still, again, just to emphasize, we are very, very far from the idea of one set of quality curriculum materials in a set of classrooms, even in an individual state. So that's one thing I want to emphasize, and I would say that if you were to ask me, and I sort of write this in the book, what is the defining characteristic of American education? It is this: it is decentralization and local control. Second thing I want to talk about is and it's related, is politics and culture war issues. And we see culture war issues happening quite a lot right now with regard to American schools. For the most part, right now, I think that those issues are focused on race-related content and LGBT-related content in the curriculum. That's where we see the most attention right now. Of course, there is a long history of culture wars in schools that bounce around from one subject to another. But I don't think that mathematics is immune from those culture wars. Certainly there have been math wars in the past. But I think that we're already seeing some flickers of math-related culture wars that are cropping up in some districts. So an example of that is debates over acceleration and tracking and detracking, right? In middle school mathematics leading into high school mathematics. Things like, when do we put kids in algebra? Do we delay that because we think that that's better for children's development or for equity? Do we allow kids to enroll in early algebra or geometry in middle school, even if that exacerbates inequities? We've seen places like very high-profile districts. San Francisco Unified had a detracking experiment that just recently was rejected by San Francisco voters, who are by no means conservative, because they felt like their students weren't being given sufficient challenge. And I think that those kinds of culture war debates are likely to continue to crop up. I think we're also likely to hear, if we're not seeing already, people starting to talk about a science of math. I don't know enough about math to know whether there is a good science of math like there is a science of reading. But you can bet that people, both scrupulous and unscrupulous, will be trying to use that term to get their products sold, to get whatever their intervention is implemented in schools. I think we also have the case, Common Core has been mentioned. It's funny to talk about. It's funny to even think about. I've only been a professor for 14 years. When I started as an assistant professor, Common Core didn't even exist yet. One of the great things I had the opportunity to do as a graduate student was be a part of a National Academies group that was thinking about common standards, and me and my advisor wrote a chapter for that book. And then all of a sudden, common standards came about. Common Core, we had the same standards in 45-ish states. It was a huge accomplishment that this actually got done after years and years of talking. Then it became a huge political flashpoint during the Obama administration. It was I would get into a taxi cab and they would say, "What do you do?" And I would say, "Oh, I do education." They would say, "What do you think about Common Core?" Right? And so that's always my barometer for what's the current issue of the day. And for a while, that was all you heard about was Common Core. They called it Obama Core. And now it's like we've completely forgotten about it. And no one even hardly talks about standards anymore. We've sort of moved on to curriculum. But states are still revising standards, have the opportunity to revise standards. Some states have made revisions already. I think some states, in particular red states, have made revisions that try and push back against certain I would say, politicized aspects of standards that they don't like. But that issue around how are states going to revise standards moving forward, I think, is also important. And so politics was the second issue. And then the third issue I wanted to talk about was COVID. And I do think that it's hard to overstate the impact that COVID has had on American education. I think both just in terms of the things we all know about student achievement, whether you want to call it learning loss or whether you want to call it something else, about how much student performance has declined, evidently less so in the US than in other OECD countries, which is, I guess, an accomplishment. But it's not just student achievement, that there is a disconnection from public schools that seems to be rising, right? So we had people disenroll early in COVID, and that disenrollment is sticky, meaning that some of those folks have not come back, right? There's an increase in homeschooling, there's an increase in private schooling, and that is a real concern. At the same time, that's being accelerated by policies, particularly in red states, to give vouchers and education savings accounts that, again, are accelerating sort of an exodus from traditional public schools. Another sign of this disconnection is attendance. So this week, there's been a lot of reporting on attendance. We had a piece out that came out on Tuesday, and then the New York Times had a feature about attendance this morning. And a lot of people are very concerned about absenteeism, which has essentially, chronic absenteeism has doubled and has not returned to pre-pandemic levels. And what are the causes of that? How do we get kids back in classroom? How are we going to get them up to, Shanghai levels of achievement if they're not in the classroom? And I think that there are lots of very complicated causes behind this disconnection. Some of it is illnesses, the way we've changed attitudes towards sickness. Some of it is things are available online now, so the student is absent and they feel like they can just do what's online and that'll be just as good as if they're in person. And some of it, I think, is technologies, right? So students are spending too much time gaming or spending time on social networks and not feeling like they need to be in person. But it's I think it's as big a crisis as I've seen in a very long time in the system. And at the same time, as these trends are happening, you have grades that are going up and graduation rates that are going up and attainment that is going up. And this disconnect between, I think, the messages that parents are receiving about how their kids are doing and what's going on in the classroom and the reality of what we can measure from these more objective measures like test scores and attendance is very troubling. And so these are some of the things that I'm thinking about. And, and my hope is that whatever reforms we're pursuing to math education or other subjects, that we're appreciating and recognizing and dealing with the complexity of American education, the decentralization, that we are anticipating potential culture war things that could flare up, and that we are really grappling with the serious harms to the system that have been done by COVID.
Well, actually, let's just see if there's any questions before we move on.
I was thinking all day about the absenteeism article. I was thinking of, what's the analogy, are we on the deck of the Titanic, or are we on the head of the pen, or, what are we doing? Talking about something as important as mathematics improvement, when the looming crisis is the students aren't going to be able to take advantage of improved instruction.
And I think it's that, and I really do think, I really do have serious concerns about the role of technology with young people, and I think that these things are very interconnected. And I don't know that I think there is growing urgency around the attendance issue, but I think, as I was talking with reporters and things about it yesterday and today, it's not just one thing, right? There's many, many causes, and we have to understand what those are to address them. It is everything from my school doesn't value my culture, and I don't feel safe in school. And we did see during COVID that Black and brown kids were more likely to want to be at home, or Black and brown families were more likely to want to be at home, and undoubtedly that had something to do with the way that those students are represented and treated in schools. It has to do with that. It has to do with illnesses, which, the school systems don't have too much that they can do with. It has to do with, I really do think we send a bad, I struggle with this as a college teacher. We send a certain message when we say, if you don't show up, well, it'll be available online and you can just look at it, as if that is comparable, and we know that it is not. And so there's just a lot of issues that I think have all come together.
On the issue of absenteeism, I don't think actually that schools are concerned about the children, frankly. They're concerned about the fact that they're losing money for these children not showing up. But I think that there is a complacency about which kids are not there, and a feeling that maybe there are fewer disruptions now that they are not here. And so I think that it is a bigger societal problem than just the kids who didn't come back. I mean, I've talked in Houston with the district. They've lost 25,000 students over the last 5 years. Nobody's looking for them. Houston was a city in which we had an effort where people went door to door. The community participated in door-to-door visits to the homes of children who didn't show up. None of that's happening. I think they're just as happy not to have them there, except for the fact that they've lost all that money. And I think that says something about our society that's as worrisome as any of the other issues that we've talked about today.
I pretty much agree with you. I mean, I would say I don't want to. I mean, I actually think it's good that schools are incentivized to get people to show up with dollars. I think that's totally fine. But it's clear to me that there's not enough urgency. And that said, I don't want to blame educators who are themselves very overwhelmed, and I think things have gotten more difficult, and educators, many of whom have children themselves, a very large proportion, and I think many of them feel like they're doing the best that they can, but I really do think that, my mantra is pretty much like, we can't leave it up to 13,000 school districts to figure out how to solve these big systemic problems, or 3 million individual teachers. And that's true of curriculum, and it's also true of attendance. And so whatever the solutions are, they need to be big and bold, and they need to be really supported from state departments of education, and and targeted at those who are the most affected.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed all of the presentations all of this morning. Just to say a little bit about who I am. So my name is Yvonne. I'm currently in the math department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And one of the reasons why I got into math education in the first place, with an emphasis on both the math and the education, is that when I was in high school, I went to a public school, and I noticed a lot of variation in teaching quality, even in my public school, even just in the math department. And I thought to myself then that this was, if I was seeing this in my school, surely there's nothing so special about my school. There's variation everywhere. And I thought, what if I could grow up and try to do something about this? At the same time, I kind of fell in love with math and just being able to do proof and proving, especially in geometry. And then then in my naivety as a teenager, I went to a school that had no teacher education program. And so when I graduated in my senior year, I thought, I'll be a high school teacher. But it turns out you need to be certified for that. And I had not done any of the work to do that. And so instead, I went to math graduate school, where I eventually got a PhD writing a dissertation on hyperbolic geometry and geometric group theory. When I proved the theorem that was able to get me to graduate, it was like this, this weight lifted, because I knew then I was going to actually be able to graduate. And also the space was created to remember why I was in this in the first place, which was to try to do something to improve teacher education. And at that time, this is 2008 or so. So Google was around and still giving us good results. And I just went on Google Scholar and I started thinking about, surely there must be something special about the way that teachers have to know math to teach math in a way that students can understand the math. And little did I know that there was an entire body of literature on this. Catalyzed in part by Lee Shulman's presidential address, built on by people like Deborah Ball at the University of Michigan. And then I was so lucky as to get a postdoc in the math department at Michigan. And then that allowed me to make a connection to the School of Education. And so I ended up working with Deborah Ball's group for about 3.5 years before taking the position that I have now. Deborah's work is mostly at the elementary level, some at the middle level. I was keenly interested in trying to take the idea of mathematical knowledge for teaching and putting it at the high school level, and really wondering seriously, teachers at the high school level in the US and in many countries are asked to take classes like abstract algebra or real analysis. And one logic behind that is if you understand the foundations of the mathematics, then it should have this trickle-down effect into how you enact that mathematics in teaching in schools. But there's also been lots of documented research, evidence that says that there's a lot of high school teachers, not just in the US, but around the world, in Israel, in France, in England, in Canada, that see these requirements as hoops to jump through because there's seemingly no connection between real analysis and their abstract algebra course experiences and secondary school teaching. And so my mission was to try to find a way to bring these two things together, to bring together mathematics teaching practice as a professional practice that had specialized knowledge and skills, and also mathematics as a discipline. And so the most recent project that I've been involved with is called the Modules Project, and I headed the research aspect of it, and we have produced curriculum materials that are now being used in at least 50 schools in the US and Canada. These are institutions of higher education, and we have curriculum materials in algebra, geometry, statistics, and mathematical modeling. Across the sample that we've been able to get, we've seen increases in mathematical knowledge for teaching. More importantly than that, we've also seen teachers that now come back and say, we did all of this proof and proving, this mathematical modeling, this statistical reasoning, and we see its relevance to what we're going to do in the future. And so what I want to emphasize here is that we've heard so much this morning about the importance of teachers and the importance of mathematical knowledge. And I also want to emphasize that I hope that whatever we do, we don't see these as separate and siloed from each other, but there's a real concerted effort not to just pump mathematical knowledge into the system, but to have it cohere with what it takes to teach. That's two things, right? Mathematics and pedagogy. There's also this issue of all of the inequities that we see throughout the system. One of the points that Andreas made in his presentation is a theme that we've heard in the study of instructional improvement and in a lot of other studies where variation within is greater than variation across. In the US, there's about 100,000 schools. Of those, about 48,000 are Title I eligible. What it means to be Title I eligible is that at least 40% of the students fall below a certain social economic status line. There are inequities everywhere, and there's also potential for inequity in so many schools and so many districts. And one of the lessons that we've learned from the standards-based movement and studies and measures based on the standards-based reform movement is that even if in aggregate things might look like they're improving if you see adherence to principles based on standards-based reform, once you look at the data disaggregated across maybe not gender as much for some of the reasons that Andreas was talking about, but if you look at it across socioeconomic status lines, if you look at it across race or ethnicity, if you look at it across whether somebody is an English language learner or not, you start to see that there are inequities. In aggregate, things may look like they're good. It may look like, in aggregate, that when we follow standards-based reform, things are peachy. But once you look at it disaggregated, it becomes very clear that what we think of as good teaching or good teaching practice falls apart. And so we need to rethink what it means to teach, not only teach well, but to also teach equitably. And when we're talking about the mathematical knowledge that you might need to lead a good discussion or to encourage participation, we can't just look at participation in the aggregate. We also have to make sure that there's participation that's equitably distributed. And to do that, I would say that we probably also need to rethink how we parse and articulate what are the enduring problems of teaching, and also what are the teaching practices that might move the needle for equitable teaching. And with that, we also need to rethink when we make connections from mathematics to secondary teaching practice, how can we make them in ways that are tied to equitable teaching?
Susan.
Thank you. I worked with Deborah over the years, and truly the study of instructional improvement, was a CPRE study. So over all those years, I felt in my gut that the deep knowledge of the of mathematical knowledge for teaching, and that of students was something that was innate with a good teacher, or a good teacher could learn. But now we have an opportunity of supplementing the knowledge about student learning with AI, with other tools. And I just wonder how you think about that.
I think almost any of us have thought about this. It's hard not to think about AI if you are living in the modern world.
Yeah.
Janine Remillard has all of these interesting studies that are looking at how you visualize data about teaching and learning. And hers is not the only one. But I think that there is a lot of opportunity to use AI to connect math and teaching practice and in equitable ways. And part of that goes back to what Jeff was saying about, how do we have measures that not just measure what students are learning and who might be learning them, but also what's actually happening in the classroom. Because if we have protocols that are predicated on notions of good teaching that are based on standards-based reform, we might be missing something. I think there's really exciting work by, for example, Joni Wilson has I think it's the EARMI, Equity and Access rubric for math instruction. So she's come up with this list of teaching practices that seem to be common features of classrooms where majority Black and brown kids are doing really well. So I think it's like if we are going to use AI, we also need to think about what's going into that AI and how the protocols are being designed.
Can I just make one follow-up comment? I mean, another interesting issue that comes up is how to help ensure that learning that is very site-based, or in the case of AI augmentation that might be very site-based, generalizes or scales up in some way. And so one of my, I don't know whether it's a concern but just something that I would like to learn more about, and I think the Singapore example is maybe a good one, is how when you're a fan of site-based learning, a fan of attending to some of the kind of variation that Yvonne was just talking about, how we can make sure to codify that and have it, go beyond a single group of teachers, a single school, a single district, so that it is more generally applicable on the one hand, but also attentive to variation that really matters among, that's driven by context, either features of local schools, the students that are being taught, on the other hand. So I don't think that's really an answer, but it's that there's something else that needs to be understood here when things are locally generated, or augmented in ways that are very particular by AI. And so that's one thing that I worry about. I have no idea how to study it, but it seems important. So I grabbed the microphone from Yvonne. Were there any more questions for Yvonne before we move on?
Yeah, Yvonne, we talk about the preparation of elementary school teachers as compared to the secondary school teachers, where 1 or 2 courses in mathematics is all that they have, and it might be a math course as opposed to a math practices, or vice versa, only a math practice course with no math beyond what they did in high school, which might have stopped at algebra 1 or 2. How can we address that issue in teacher preparation programs?
That's so as I'm thinking about what you said, I'm also thinking about the fact that in the U.S., most primary school teachers are not specialists. And so if we're going to have the same person teaching reading and social studies and English, we would hope that they have preparation for all of those kinds of subjects. You know, I have a kindergartner, and you know, on her report card, I see things about American history or American culture. I do live in the U.S. And I also see things about, you know, counting and adding, and I also see things about reading. And so I hope that this kindergarten teacher and all kindergarten teachers can actually do all that. And so I think any solution to shoring up knowledge for teaching has to take into account that in this country, at least, many elementary school teachers are teaching so many subjects. That said, I think it's not just about the preparation, but it's also about the development. You know, there's a lot of intricate math, even when dealing with fractions, even when dealing with addition. And those kinds of representations and those ways of subtly thinking about how we represent fractions, why it would be the case that multi-digit addition is not just a formula, but actually is something that could make sense if you understand the base 10 system. Those are things that there is no place in the curriculum that people learn that, except for, one hopes, courses that are taught by math departments for future teachers. And so in some sense, it's true that that doesn't go beyond algebra or calculus, and yet in another sense, it's also true that it goes far deeper. And so I think one thing to look for is to make sure that in math departments across the countries, you know, math departments may influence about 70,000 teachers a year. I hope that all of those math departments are taking seriously this opportunity to shape teachers' knowledge by using curriculum materials that actually probe deeper in ways that actually matter for teaching. I also hope that teachers are given the resources and space to develop themselves further in math that's aligned with pedagogy and in ways that allow them to enact equitable teaching. And so part of that is, you know, if there is something that goes beyond calculus, what would that something be that there is a warrant for teaching and learning for the grade level that they're at? Yes.
I just want to amplify, you know, the first point I mentioned was about decentralization. That's also true in teacher education, and that is a difficult problem of teacher education. Is we have thousands of institutions that prepare teachers that range from, you know, quite elite schools to schools that are basically open admission, and where faculty are the leading researchers in the field to where faculty have, you know, no particular research expertise. So that's another huge challenge. If you're talking about changing teacher preparation, you're talking about changing hundreds and thousands of institutions. And so that is to some extent why I'm a little bit more optimistic about things that happen after teachers are in the classroom maybe than I am things that happen at universities, because I know lots of professors.
You mentioned the science of math might be coming forward. Are you seeing a focus in that on this issue of ensuring that elementary school teachers have a real background in mathematics, understanding, so that they'll be prepared to to implement that? I mean, the science of reading meant that we sent lots and lots of teachers to programs, whether they're offered by places like Nijhuis Center or, nonprofits that are focused on reading, but we don't have many math nonprofits that are working on improving the quality of teaching mathematics in our schools. And so I'm wondering whether if we can move to the science of mathematics, it will make a difference, because we don't have the troops to come in and help. I don't know, Charlie may have found some answers in England, but I don't see that we have the structures in place to make it happen here. Yvonne, am I wrong?
Well, I think it depends on what we mean by science of math. I want to finish this point quickly to make sure that we hear from Maisha. I think that it is true that we could understand more of how students learn at every grade level. I think that there's a lot of robust studies in early childhood and to some degree in elementary school. There's also some studies for some areas of mathematics in the middle and high school levels. But even the ones at the high school levels, even when they're well done, they only cover one thing, right? Like maybe we have something for concept to function, maybe we have something for transformations, but that's it. And so if we're going to have a science of math, I think that there's a lot more work that would need to go into it, and it has to do with both the science, or I guess the evidence base for how students learn and what they're learning, as well as measurements on what kind of teaching practices there are that move the needle, and teaching practices not only as a general articulation of recurrent work of teaching, but also mathematical work of teaching predicated to specific areas of math.
I also don't want to take too much time, and I also don't want to extend the pessimism wagon on our non-system of education. But I fear we're headed in the wrong direction. I'm not an expert in this area, but I see excellent examples of preparation for both elementary, middle, and high school teachers. They don't serve a lot of teachers. And most of the stuff that is getting, I'll just use a unkind verb, peddled by education companies, is pretty insubstantial. And it's not taking seriously the kinds of things that teachers would need to learn. And, it's not really a solution to our U.S. problem, but, more focus, more depth, more coordination, more system would be helpful here. And actually, one of the questions I had for Andreas earlier but didn't get to ask is whether there are countries that are successful that have systems that are as decentralized as ours, and decentralized in almost every way, by state, by curriculum, by standards, by preparation, and certainly by learning opportunity for students, and whether the decentralized countries have been successful at improving, opportunity. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but I would like to be optimistic. I would like some examples here where, when 1,000 flowers bloom, it actually is beautiful. I have not seen that here in this country. So. You can pass if you want, or you can respond if you want.
I think it's a really important question, and it depends how you look at decentralization. From the top, the U.S. looks like a highly decentralized system. I'm not sure that is the way it looks from the perspective of a school. Actually, the one thing that we do measure is actually the discretion that teachers have on, learning environments, or school leaders have on, hiring people, that is actually quite limited according to our data. So you can say there's a lot of, discretion at the level of school districts, local levels, which actually leads to the kind of atomization of the system you describe. But, if you ask yourself, as a school leader, as a teacher, do I really have a lot of, discretion? And it's not just autonomy, and it's also, if you have discretion, it usually strengthens the collaborative culture. Do I feel, I'm part of a strong profession as an individual teacher? I'm not so sure. I actually think the kind of system you have here often leads to an even greater centralization when you see that from the idea of a teacher. So, and there are systems that make different choices. Actually, if you're interested, that's something that we report every 3 years in the OECD. How is it decision-making responsibility distributed? You could look to, actually, England would be a country where you could say, well, as a school, you do have a lot more kind of degrees of freedom than you have a school in the US. And you'd find others in the Nordic countries. What they typically have, layers in the middle that put the system together. As a teacher, you're part of a larger professional community. You share your practice. As a school, you're part of a network that gets sort of moderated in terms of resources and so on. So I think the governance question is a lot more complex than saying, the US is more devolved than other systems, and that stands in the way. I'm not sure that's actually easy to support with at least the data we have. When we look at basically the teacher, the school, the local level, the state level, and the central level, on what can they decide and in what framework.
That's really helpful. And is this still on? Yeah. I think we want to be thinking about, with an improvement hat on, really thinking about ways that countries that have very different systems, often with very different levels of support and different roles for teachers, actually, can still handle improving opportunity for kids where the rubber really hits the road. So anyway, with that, I'm going to pass it over to Maisha.
Hi, so I'm Maisha Moses, and I think I'll share some of my story. My work is very much on the ground. Primarily, I work with the children who are not being served by the system, the children who are performing in the bottom 25%, bottom 35% in their mathematics, children who are from low-income communities, and primarily Black children and Latino children. And the question that we have for them is, how much do they have to do to try to not only get an education for themselves, but to help the country figure out how to educate all children? And so the organization that I work for is called the Young People's Project. It grows out of the Algebra Project. The Algebra Project was started by my father. His name is Bob Moses. He passed away in 2021. The first sort of part of his life was sort of consecrated in the civil rights movement in Mississippi in the 1960s. He was from New York City. He was born and raised in Harlem. And he went to Mississippi and organized, he worked with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to organize Black sharecroppers around the right to vote. And he learned through that process from 1960 to 1964, working with the people at the bottom. The way he talked about it, they were able to get Jim Crow out of public accommodations, out of the right to vote, and out of the Democratic Party structure. What he said many years later in his life, he said, well, we didn't get Jim Crow out of education. We didn't get it out of health. We didn't get it out of housing, out of any of the other major sort of social institutions in the country. And so he later started working on education as an extension of his civil rights work. And he started that in the 80s when I was in the 8th grade. And he wanted me to take algebra. He thought I was ready to take algebra because he had taught me math when I was growing up. I did school math and I did his math at home. And when I was in the 8th grade, I was tired of that. And so I wouldn't do it with him. And so he made a deal with my teacher. And he went to my teacher and he said, I want Maisha to take algebra. And she said, well, I can't teach it because she was a social studies teacher. She couldn't teach algebra. She didn't know enough to teach it. And he said, okay, well, I'll come into class and I'll teach Maisha during math class. And she said, okay, and would you be willing to teach these 3 other students as well because they are also ready for algebra? And so he said yes. And in doing so, he sort of stumbled into the ways in which, for math education in particular, and education in general, access and opportunity is sorted along race and class lines in the country. And so his civil rights button was pushed, and he spent the rest of his life working on equity in math education. And he brought a very interesting, unique perspective to it. He had been studying the philosophy of math at Harvard for his PhD program, and he was looking at a philosophy which talked about how mathematics comes into being and gets off the ground through the regimentation of ordinary experiences, and that this is universal. And math talks about things in a way that people do not talk about things. So I would say that I am taller than Yvonne, right? Mathematics would force me to say Maisha's height is greater than Yvonne's height. But so he took an approach to mathematics to help students make the conceptual shift from arithmetic to algebra by using everyday experiences to help them think about mathematical concepts and mathematical representations. And the Young People's Project was started by children who were in the Algebra Project, for whom that experience was so powerful that it really opened themselves up, not just to mathematics, but also to each other, because the learning was collaborative. The classroom was organized as a meeting space where children had a lot of space and time to talk about their ideas and, make various mathematical conjectures and go through a process of agreeing or coming to consensus about, a standard approach. And so those children who had that experience, and also some of older Algebra Project alumni, including my brother, started the Young People's Project in response to my dad sort of chiding them, telling them that the young people have to get their act together. So everything that we've been talking about, both the atomization of American public education, but also the disempowerment of teachers and principals and even school leaders, and sort of the paradox of that situation, and the fact that elementary teachers really don't know math. So if you're a child in that situation, what do you do? And a lot of children, and I experienced it for many years in my career, they vote with their feet and they cause disruption, and then they get blamed as being the problem. And I was so attracted to the Young People's Project because in YPP, children who were having the same experience had organized themselves to try to be the change, so to speak, and to try to do something about it. One of the things that we do that's really cool in the Young People's Project is we play games that get them to look really deeply at small pieces of mathematics. And so the children have to learn these games, right? So what is going to attract them to become a math teacher. Not so much doing more of the same math that already doesn't work for them, right? So can we repackage some mathematical experiences that they find engaging so that they're willing and interested to teach it to each other? And so that idea is sort of the idea of mathematical games played on mathematical objects. And we have one really, really cool game. It's called the Flagway module. And it takes a small piece of mathematics, it's based on the Mobius function, but we physicalized it. And so the children have to run a big floor structure where they're translating numbers into colors to navigate a pathway based on the Mobius function. And so that is sort of our approach to make it meaningful and engaging. The other thing we do, I think, is we structure help. When I talk to schools and I talk to districts, I say that, well, yes, there are all these problems, but you're also really, really rich in children. And if you can choose to and figure out how to invest in your children, who you currently now think is the problem, you think your children is the problem, but you can actually invest in the children so that they can help each other and that they become part of helping to solve the problem and that they become an asset. And so that's really what the Young People's Project is putting on the table. I think that as our work has gotten deeper and as we've been invited to collaborate more with schools and with districts, I think that children need the opportunity to help each other almost as a matter of right, certainly as a matter of responsibility, given the context in the United States. And especially those children who are suffering from the deep structural inequities. If the system isn't going to do it for them, then they have to figure out how to do it for themselves and for each other, and that they should have the right to do it and the responsibility to do it. And when you have to learn something well enough to teach it, then you really know it. And it's not that they have to learn all of mathematics. They just have to learn bits and pieces well enough to teach it. And they can do that starting from a fairly young age, actually.
Comments from Maisha? I'm sorry, I don't know everybody's name.
Hi, I'm Christina Samuels. I'm sorry, just to introduce myself again. We in the media are, as people are becoming more interested in culturally responsive mathematics and culturally responsive teaching, we are starting to get many press releases from organizations, from textbook companies. Anyway, there's many ways where it's not a very deep way of looking at instructional practice. And I can look at some of this and say no, but I'm just wondering if there's other ways that you would suggest that people evaluate this to really make sure that we're doing what we want to do, that this is really something that will help students who've been disenfranchised in so many ways.
Yeah, so I don't think of our work, the way I think about our work, it's less about being culturally responsive per se and more about making the mathematics meaningful and engaging for students. And the question of making math meaningful, I think, is probably relevant to about 80% of the population. I think the way math is currently taught, at least in the United States, it works maybe for about 20%. And I think that's maybe generous. So, 8% of Black 12th graders are proficient on the NAEP. And it's something like 24% of all 12th graders, right? So that's a small percentage. So math is not, the way it's taught, it's just not meaningful for most people. And it's been talked about across the day, what it takes to make math meaningful in terms of focus, in terms of coherence. So I think we focus on that. And the Young People's Project uniquely focuses on gamification because in terms of, when you think about children's culture, children own play. That's what they do naturally and organically with each other. And so we've just sort of harnessed that natural culture to the learning of teaching of mathematics. So you guys like to play with each other. Well, you can enjoy playing with each other doing mathematics. And we have, 25 years of experience now in figuring out how to structure spaces and opportunities for young people to create math games for one another and to facilitate math with each other. And to do it with the consciousness that in doing so, they really are working on a very important problem. I was talking to two of the high school students, we call them math literacy workers, before I came. And I said, well, I'm gonna come to this conference, to this talk, and I have to talk, and so what do you think I should say? And one said, well, we want everybody to know how hard we work. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And she said, well, we have homework, and we have family responsibilities, and we're busy, and yet we take the time to try to help our peers who are struggling. And then another one said that they think that this is a way of learning and teaching for the future, that they would like to see more children have the opportunity to learn and teach this way.
I think we should end on that. We're at time. I love your comment about play, because most of the mathematicians I know, when they're doing math, think they're playing. And so it's a nice way to think about it. It spans the whole spectrum.